everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the one, the only Science Dispatch podcast. My name is Cameron English. That young man over there is Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, the Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. Chuck, tell me about your day. What's going on?
I interacted with the health system today, so I'm still in a recovery mode from doing that. I don't want to go into that old doctor thing. It was much different in my day, which evidently was, but doesn't matter. I'm on the other side of the table, as we say now.
If you would just cut the red dye out of your diet, you wouldn't have to go see the doctor. We all know that.
That's probably true. I'll add it to the list of things I'm no longer allowed to have.
There you go. Seed
Good
oils,
news,
red
though.
dye.
Red wine does not contain any red dye number 3.
It does not. Red dye is bad. Red wine, though, although a carcinogen, is actually quite good for you. Is what I'm hearing from Team Maha. So that's good to know. We're not talking about alcohol, but we are talking about a drug, a quite scary drug from my very limited understanding. Dr. Dinnerstein. This is an article by Dr. Jeffrey Singer that was republished on our website. It's called From Fentanyl to Nitazenes, Why the Drug War Keeps Making the Danger Worse. So let me read this very brief introduction, Dr. Dinnerstein, and then give us a rundown of what's going on here. So Dr. Singer writes, after warning for years to policymakers' deaf ears that doubling down on failed drug war policies will only cause more dangerous drugs like nitazenes to emerge, we see it happening in real time. Okay, take it away.
So nitazene is a new synthetic opioid developed by the chemists in China as a result of the Chinese decision to clamp down on the production of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors. So, in the words of Dr. Singer, since they couldn't make drug A, they went on to make a more potent version called drug B, in this case, nitazene. The difficulty with nitazene is that it's even more potent than fentanyl, and I think we've discussed this before, is that these drugs have what's described as a very small therapeutic window, meaning that the range in which the drug is beneficial is small, and then it becomes lethal. And so very tiny amounts, we're talking in microgram amounts of this drug can be lethal. Now, for the people that are smuggling it into the country, that's an advantage because it means they can pack an awful lot of doses into a very small container that is more easily slipped through customs. Having grown up in the 60s and 70s when they would stop tractor trailer trucks with weed, you don't need to do much more than fill, a spare tire with these drugs to bring in far more money into the country. And obviously, the smaller the size of something being smuggled, the more difficult it is to identify it. The smaller amount also has repercussions on the user side, especially since they're generally dealing with unreliable sources of the drugs. In that when you're talking in microgram amounts and you're talking about a small therapeutic window, not having a scale that measures micrograms accurately can lead to problems. And so in this case, that's an additional concern. The drugs are not well defined before the courts, which means that the toxicology laboratories have difficulty identifying the drugs so that they are more than likely. So Jeff Singer talks about the fact that the Halt Fentanyl Act, which was passed earlier this year, is responsible for the current problems with nitazene. And what that bill did was it changed fentanyl and fentanyl precursors to Schedule I drugs, basically completely illegal and difficult to use for research. The advocates for harm reduction policies were bothered by this because they felt that the penalties for the use of these drugs would fall disproportionately upon users. And if you read the law carefully, what it points out is that 10 grams of a drug, in this case, that's about a third of an ounce, would get you a mandatory 5-year sentence in jail. But when they do the measurement of the drug, it's not 10 grams of the pure fentanyl substance, it's 10 grams of any substance containing fentanyl. So a casual user that had 3 or 4 pills would more than likely qualify for a mandatory 5-year sentence. So that's why the advocates were a little concerned about it. Dr. Singer's concerned about it is because it keeps increasing the prohibitions on the drugs and allows the chemist to switch to another type. So this is kind of an argument that we've been having for several years now, and that Dr. Singer and Dr. Bloom have both been discussing, which is that as you make the prohibitions stronger, the criminals morph to other drugs, and that until there's a shift from prohibition to harm reduction, the body count will only continue to rise.
I don't see anything changing in this regard, because both sides are dug in. I mean, the people who are behind, what they call prohibition aren't going anywhere. There's, maybe it's not the primary motivation, but there's significant money involved in, arresting people, prosecuting them, housing them in prisons. You know what I mean? Like, there's a whole industry that's built around this. So I don't see that going anywhere.
On both sides of the criminal equation. So the criminals are making a lot of money, and law enforcement is getting a great deal of funding.
The Baptists and the bootleggers, so to speak. That is a real dynamic at play here. So I guess, to make this a question, is there anything that would change this? Because I don't see like a libertarian dream candidate coming into office and saying, we're gonna make sure people have clean heroin and nothing. Like, that's not going to happen in our lifetimes, I don't think. So I don't see the way forward. Do you see?
No, I think that until we're a little bit more reflective as to how well our punishments are reducing crime, I think we're going to be stuck. I think part of the problem is that, and this is kind of what they're trying to get at when they talk about their iron law of prohibition, is that when you define the crime as being the use, the non-prescription use of fentanyl, then the non-prescription use of nitazene is a different crime. And so you don't say, well, we got rid of the fentanyl, so we've been successful there, so let's apply it to another drug. The real crime is that people wind up heavily addicted to substances, and that causes them to act out in what's considered antisocial ways. Dr. Halstead, who was the founding member of Johns Hopkins and for surgery, was addicted to cocaine and morphine. And he's still venerated as the founding member of U.S. American surgery, because those addictions, which were no different really than the addictions that someone might have to fentanyl, didn't result in some antisocial behavior. So if the problem is that people become addicted to these substances and act out in antisocial ways, then I think if that's the crime, then we should stop worrying about which particular drug it is and look more at what we can do to get people that are addicted to certain drugs to act in less antisocial ways. That, I guess, is where the clean needle programs come from, or the methadone program, if that's a better fit, that you can now get your drugs on a daily basis, and you're not running around looking for money or finding other ways to support a
I,
habit.
that kind of a third way approach seems more viable to me. The problem that I see, or at least the potential problem, and I don't know what Dr. Singer's views are on some of these things, but I've seen quite a few harm reduction advocates balk at things that would be necessary. So, for example, arresting people for pooping on the street or for using in public places, where there's kids or where they could be a disturbance either to public health or to public safety. There's the same group I believe is very adamantly opposed to reinstitutionalization. So if you find someone, keeled over in the street in some weird position because they're on fentanyl or whatever, they would say you don't have a right to put that person in an institution or to send them to mandatory treatment because they have rights and right, the libertarian argument. So the question I have for you then is, are any of those things worth doing? Like just as a taxpayer and a voter and a guy, a father, whatever, that seems to make sense to me. Like if you want to use heroin in your house and you can do it responsibly, I really don't care. But when you do it adjacent to the playground where I take my kids, that's where we have a problem. And that's what we have to address if we're ever going to get towards legalization.
That's certainly part of it. It's interesting because they were talking about it today in terms of the homeless, of which many of the homeless have severe mental health issues. And obviously one group is now pushing for involuntary admission to the hospitals, which used to be the case up until the 70s when everybody was put into group home settings with the thought that would be better. And the liberals argue that we have that these individuals have a right to not be institutionalized. And I think that you can make an argument back and forth about that. But what I was thinking as I was listening to it is they also have a right to have a healthier life. And when posed that way, then hospitalization tends to make a little bit more sense. People that are addicted to substances that are acting out in antisocial ways, I think have a right to have a life where they're not so antisocial. And because it's not helping them either. It's simply along those lines. So how you sort that out remains very difficult.
No doubt.
It's easier on a case-by-case basis than it is for a policy basis. And it's certainly difficult when you turn it over to a bunch of legislators who were previously attorneys.
It's chaos. It's chaos. As we've learned with the lawyer that we have on here regularly, the word can mean one thing to you, and the word can mean something entirely different in a courtroom.
Right. Well, I think that was a lesson for President Clinton.
Right.
Does
is mean is, or does it mean that? Yeah. And back to the topic, though. The thing I find challenging, just for example, this morning I went to go get gas. I had my daughter in the car because she's homesick. That's not relevant, just a sympathy point. Young child involved. There was a homeless guy crossing a major thoroughfare, like 4 lanes of traffic in both directions. The guy's obviously high. He's got no shoes on, no shirt, and he's crossing it like it's a crosswalk. That is an obvious threat to public safety, both to him and to people in a car. Like if a car slams into him at 45 miles an hour, what's the public health impact of that? All of you guys that are so sympathetic to these drug users. Like that's a serious risk, right? Now, if someone calls the cops on that guy, he might get picked up if they can find him when the cops show up an hour later. He's not going to be charged with anything. He's not going to get any treatment. He'll be released later in the day. And then we go on with the same sort of thing. So I guess like these things have to be addressed. And I think one of the reasons, if I could suggest this, we should have Jeff on sometime to talk about this. I think one of the reasons they struggle, the harm reduction crowd, the reason they struggle to generate public support is precisely for these reasons. It's because there are average people out there. They see bus stops turn into homeless encampments. They see used needles on the ground. And they go, this is not going to do. This doesn't work for me. And so the answer in their minds is, well, send in the cops, put these people away because I'm tired of this bullshit. I think that's what you're dealing with. So if they were a little more flexible in saying, okay, maybe if someone is frozen on the street. I forget the term when someone uses an opioid and they're frozen. What's that called? Okay, I've heard like
you got me. I don't know.
Or maybe it's another drug. Anyways, right? They're laying on the ground in the fetal position because they're high out of their minds, and they're in front of a business, right? They're on someone's private property, and nobody cares. Until you fix that, you're not going to get, I don't think, widespread public support for legalization, because these are the fruits of those policies as far as people are concerned, and that needs to change. Your thoughts?
Well, that's certainly the most visible fruits of that. So, and going back to your idea of the per person crossing the road, when you talk about the public health part, so most people would point to the fact that he's going to be injured and the state is going to pick up the costs for his recovery. But I think we should broaden it and ask about, what about the trauma to the driver who didn't expect to find somebody walking across the middle of a street when they were going 45 miles an hour on an area where there was not supposed to be pedestrians? What about the trauma to that person? Who's going to be able to deal with that? You have to at some point broaden your viewpoint and take into account all the risks and all the problems for all the people that are involved. This kind of gets back to that. And I hate to be saying this, it gets back to the quality of life broken window issues. That you're not going to go downtown to take a walk past the nice stores when there are people lying in the street or there are people aggressively accosting you. People are not going to do that. And until we clean up those simple crimes, may be a tough word for that, but until we clean up those simple behaviors, we're not going to see that kind of civility return, and it feeds upon itself.
Yes, it's called frozen addict syndrome, by the way, what I was talking about.
I heard that little typing. Dr. Google says it's frozen addict syndrome. Thank you, Dr.
I mean, I'm not claiming to know much about it, but I did double check. Opioid-induced rigidity, or frozen addict syndrome, is what I was talking about. Just so people know, I'm not making that up. But yeah, I agree with you. I think like the biggest solution ultimately is to kill the demand for these, or limit the demand for these. And again, that gets into territory like you were just talking about, where nobody wants to deal with it, right? Everyone's got a right. We've got a right to this. This person's a victim, but we have no responsibilities to one another anymore. I think that's what's missing from this conversation, right? Like, you have a responsibility to pay your taxes or the government will lock you up. And very few people go, oh, but the poor taxpayer, put him in jail. How dare you? He's got a right to his money. Nobody thinks like that, right? We have certain categories where something is an inalienable right, and on the same grounds, something else is not, because we've all decided that, you have to give your money to the government. Or if they want you to go fight a war, you just have to because, your country needs you or whatever. But on these certain things, someone has a right to use fentanyl on the street and sleep in front of your storefront. That costs you thousands of dollars a month. And if you don't like it, well, what are you anti-freedom? It's like,
both sides use these arguments when it suits their purposes.
That's exactly my point. Very, very succinctly put, Dr. Dinnerstein.
And there's very few times when people are, I'm willing to cut my kith and kin as much slack as is necessary, but I'm not willing to do the same for the other. And depending upon how we define those groups, I think has a lot to do with, how we come down on any of these issues. And I think we've said this, I've certainly said this before, is that when you want to get at the roots of addiction, you get into very expensive problems to resolve. I think that a lot of these things, I'm still going to go with Angus Deaton on this, that these are moments of despair, and that if you were able to provide a good education and some job opportunities, a lot of the problems that we face would be gone. But that's far more expensive and complex to deal with than simply saying
Yeah,
Beat 'em up,
that's not
lock
the
'em up.
answer. And again, this is why the third way angle makes sense to me, right? It's like if someone's struggling with a heroin addiction, putting them in state prison, that's bad, right? If anything, that's just going to solidify them in their criminal behavior or their criminal mindset. I think that's actually been pretty well documented. You send someone for a minor drug offense to prison, and then they learn how to make shanks, and then they learn how to, smuggle drugs into a prison, and then they learn how to fight. It's like that's not the answer. But there's a sort of like there's an allergy to any kind of collective action or behavior on this, unless it's let these people have their drugs. And I just, like by itself, that doesn't work, I don't think.
No, it's not going to solve everything. It's not going to solve the underlying issue. So again, we've not solved another
you're right.
problem.
We have not. But this problem, everyone knows the answer to this, right? Like if you have kids, take care of them, love them, teach them how to function in the world. That's the ultimate answer.
I'd like to believe that was completely true. That your children have not become teenagers.
they're already jerks.
How they
I know it's coming, but they're already, if my son doesn't want to stop watching Dragon Tales and I say, it's time to go to bed, he goes, no, and he swings it, I'm like, you're not going to hit me, get your ass in your room. Anyways, like the answers are there if we want them. I just don't think we want them, right? We want freedom, whatever that nebulous term means. Okay, problem not solved. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Once again, the article is called From Fentanyl to Nitazenes, Why the Drug War Keeps Making the Danger Worse by Dr. Jeffrey Singer. Go to acsh.org, if you want to read that. Punch in your email address on the subscribe tab. We'll send you the stories that we publish. The ones you read are usually the ones we talk about. Check us out on social media at acsh.org on X, at Kim J. English on X. We're on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. Our colleague Anna Delaski is doing great videos and infographics answering all your pressing science questions. So go check that out and subscribe there as well. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.